Hi and welcome back, history fans, to another reaction video where we try to learn something new and to spread history on YouTube. Today we're going to continue with the Cold War from OverSimplified, so part 2. As always, I would like to have your take on the topic. You have polls in the top of the video that are going to pop up during the video, so please answer them. And also I would like to have your take on this topic in the comment section below. As always, you can suggest videos in the comment section below, which you want to be covered from me. And as always, I would like you to be a part of the community. If you like the video, you can hit the subscribe button, and don't forget the notification bell to get notified when new videos come out. And also there's a Patreon page. But everything you need to know is in the description below. So let's just jump into the video. And as always, the link to the original video is in the description below. So go give them a view and a like, because OverSimplified really deserves it. They make really good videos. Okay. Let's start with it.
This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community where you can learn just about anything. Support my channel by signing up using the link below and get your first 2 months for free. For anyone who thinks recent US history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the US immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any US involvement in the plan, so he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But Castro felt there was still an impending US threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just going to suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union, so Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade. The US Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba, and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat.
The thing with Cuba is it was beneficial for both sides, for Cuba and the USSR, because by that the USSR could hit the US mainland, and Cuba would kind of be secure from a US invasion because they could threaten with using the weapons. So if you invade us, we are going to launch the weapon. So it was beneficial for both sides, the USSR and Cuba. Regarding the US, though, back then, I think they're called IBM's intercontinental ballistic missiles or something like that. So back then, as he said, they were medium range, so the USSR couldn't fire on the US, and the US from their mainland couldn't fire on the European part of the Soviet Union. So the US actually installed their missiles in Turkey, which is also a NATO ally, so they could more easily fire upon the European part of the Soviet Union. And then the Soviets said, well, we're going to do the same, and then they're installed on Cuba. Because until the intercontinental ballistic missiles, or IBMs, or whatever they are called, were developed, they needed to either drop the bomb via plane or something like that, which was more risky, and which could be intercepted more easily. And that's why they installed the missiles on Cuba.
Heading to Cuba and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The US did the same and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between
Europe
the two
in the
sides
middle,
broke
not
down as
again.
Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. And for the first time in history, US Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The US finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the US were set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, "Hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba?" Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief, except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately...
Back then during the Cold War, I don't know if you know about the Doomsday Clock. If not, go and look up what it is. After the video, it's very interesting. But they kind of adjust a clock and if the clock hits midnight, like the world is on the brink of collapse. I think that the Doomsday Clock is now 1 minute before midnight, so it's pretty close to destroying the world. But yeah, anyhow. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Doomsday Clock, and everybody was like on the brink of war and everything. And as you see, like back then, like small decisions, like the submarine guy Arkhipov, or that I think that was his name, Arkhipov. He decided to not launch a nuclear missile on the U.S. If he did that, like the world would be destroyed. And there was also an incident. I think it was. I'm not sure if it was in the USSR or in the US, but where inside of a station a radar was malfunctioning, and everybody was thinking like, oh my God, the other side is invading us, and we need to launch the missiles because they are going to launch the missiles and everything. But eventually also an officer noticed like, no, those are like birds in the sky. Those aren't planes, those are birds. So he also stopped the launch of the nuclear weapons. So just imagine how many times back in the Cold War and today also, there were incidents where we were so close to destroy the world, to destroy the humanity.
Yeah. Who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at...
That's a famous picture, especially in Germany. The kiss with Honecker, he was the German in East Germany. He was the what is it called in English? Like a chief officer of the Communist Party there. But regarding the kissing, there's actually a tradition in the Orthodox Church, and we all know, like Russians and all the Eastern Slavs and also Serbs and so on. They're Orthodox, and in their tradition, they kiss 3 times on the lip, three times on the cheeks, and let's say in Croatia, which is like near Serbia, but it's Roman Catholic, we kiss each other 2 times on the lips. And of course it differs from country to country, but in the time of the Cold War and in the Soviet Union, it was called the something like the Brotherhood Kiss or something like that. So every time when officials would visit each other, they would kiss 3 times on the cheeks. But if you were really close with the leader, with the other official, like if you were really friends and everything, then you would kiss on the mouth. And that's how the picture uh, was made.
At the prospect
But
of
yeah.
nuclear war. But still,
'Cause
the
he
arms
was
race
close with
raged
the-
on throughout the 60s and
Honecker.
70s. U.S. intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they would be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one. But even
Yeah.
without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a U.S. bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine.
What?
Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you gonna do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah, I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had
Wow.
gone missing
I
in the
didn't know
ocean.
that.
This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight. After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President
I
Lyndon
didn't
B.
know that.
Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East. Vietnam. Back in the 50s,
Oh
the
God, the
Vietnamese had kicked
Vietnam
their French
War.
colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into two. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime. So the north established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the south with Soviet support. The US sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong. And over
Yep.
the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India?
Yep.
LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops. And so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before. Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier.
No, you can't.
Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably
I
the
would
biggest
support
of
that
many
video.
global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear
Yeah, but the Vietnamese were pretty effective not only against the US troops, but also throughout history. If you watch other conflicts, like they were a French colony, they also kicked the French out, the Chinese, the Japanese, everybody who tried to conquer Vietnam, they had a pretty rough time doing it. And regarding the tactics, yeah, the Vietnam soldiers were pretty known for using guerrilla tactics and the environment, the jungles, and so on. We all know like some pretty basic stuff about Vietnam in the Vietnam War. But let's say during the Second World War, which was like 20 or something years ago, you kind of knew where the front was, where the enemy was, and so on. But the Vietnam War was pretty much all the time guerrilla warfare. And when the US started to use more often like bombings and everything, the Vietnamese would counter it with encircling the troops, the US troops, and get pretty close to them so that if the US starts to bomb them, they would also hit the US troops. So they were pretty effective, like really effective during the Vietnam War against the US. And of course, we also need to take into account the so-called home front, where all the new media was sending out pictures and all the atrocities that are happening there. in the inside of the U.S. So the population, I mean, the general public, as far as I know, correct me if you're American, and you maybe know more about it, but as far as I know, like on the home front, the general public was like completely anti-war because of all the pictures and atrocities that came back via the new media, like pictures and television and so on.
Of many, many global
Video.
conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their
Jeez.
ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering throughout the
We talked in in the video of like 2 days ago about the so-called term long peace, like after the Second World War. Yeah, the US and the USSR, so the two major superpowers, didn't go into a big conflict which would eventually destroy the world. But as you can see, like there were a lot of wars and a lot of human suffering that that still counts as war. So we can debate about if that term is like real or does it count or not. And also we talked in the last video. If you didn't check the first part, go check it out. But we talked about the non-aligned movement. Although they weren't supporting one side of the other or the other, like the Soviet Union or the USSR, the Soviet Union or the United States, they supported their own interests. So let's say in the Yom Kippur War or the Israeli-Arab War, let's say Yugoslavia, which was a part of the non-aligned movement and a big player in that movement, they actually supported the Arabs because they wanted to continue with their own interests. But yeah.
Third World. And in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing nation. This became this. This became this. And this became this. The new slogan that was taking root: make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War. And in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers. In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the U.S. table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in 1972, and it was a barrel of laughs.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
Put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair of
Jokester.
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president, Gerald Ford. Wow, you mean in America that people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. There it is. After the whole fiasco, Americans decided what they really wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna, where they signed yet another strategic arms limitation treaty. It's an honor, Premier Brezhnev. Likewise, President Carter. Please don't do that. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was. Heaps of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good
Just a quick note on Europe. We all know that Germany was actually the front. Like, if anywhere a conflict would start, it would start in Germany, and Germany would be the the decisive battleground. Why? Because that's like one of the rare parts of the world where those two big alliances touch. Of course, Turkey also, and Bulgaria and Turkey, and in Greece. But Germany was, because of the wall and everything, was in the focus, and a war would probably start here. And as you can see, Switzerland, of course, we all know they were neutral throughout all the major crises and wars in Europe. And then Austria, they were also neutral, like they weren't either in NATO or in the Warsaw Pact. And Austria is also not in NATO today. And Yugoslavia was part of the non-aligned movement, so they weren't on this side or on this side. So this chunk of Europe was pretty good with both sides, and they they weren't considered as fronts. So Germany was actually would be the front of a conflict.
Classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979,
In
the
a
Soviets
direct
thought it would be a
conflict.
good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted. Conservatives were concerned that US policy had become too soft. And in
Politics
1980,
and
they decided they
sports.
wanted a president who would be tough on communism. So they elected
Reagan.
Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came in guns blazing. Concerned at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire. And he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke shield around the country. But a lot of people thought it was a pretty dumb idea. The Soviet Union perceived this shift in rhetoric as the USA getting ready for war. And they were feeling especially threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down. Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean
China
airliner
with a
that
big
had strayed into
population.
their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back to mid-20th century Cold War tension. But then Brezhnev got really
Europe
old and died, and was
getting
replaced
really
by this
sick
guy
of
who
it.
was really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer. His
Yeah,
philosophy
he was.
differed a lot from previous Soviet leaders. He felt that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work,
Glasnost.
because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began the political movement
Glasnost
for
and
more openness and transparency,
Perestroika.
and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut. All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew that the arms race needed to end
course,
in order to
Gorbachev
rescue
and
the
his
Soviet
Pizza
economy,
Hut.
and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften,
Maybe
and things
evil
were
isn't the
looking
right
up.
word.
But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades,
Yeah, but as we can see throughout history, as the leaders changed in the Soviet Union, the rhetoric was more and more softened. Of course, you cannot top Stalin. Stalin was a psychopath and everything. It's hard to top Stalin. But as new leaders came, they softened the rhetoric and everything, and and eventually that would lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think that every leader that came, like Khrushchev, Gorbachev, and so on, that they were actually true believers in the cause of communism, or the Soviet-style communism, or whatever you want to call it. But they actually wanted to preserve communism. So they did all those reforms like glasnost, perestroika, and so on, because their goal was, and this is my opinion, because their goal was to preserve communism in those states.
The Soviets had been brutally suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question on Hungary's lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response:
Hungary
he didn't
had a
necessarily
tough time.
agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections. Poland followed suit and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling. But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist, Erich Honecker, and many East Germans were still eager to get out. They had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination. They traveled there in droves, and using various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was furious and blocked travel to Hungary, but that civil liberties train had started rolling, and it wasn't stopping. Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague, where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens, and a temporary refugee camp was set up. In September, deals were struck to allow the refugees to travel west via train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all this down by
domino
force,
effect.
right, guys? Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power. On November 4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left in their sights: that damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban between East and West was being lifted. The change wasn't meant to take effect until the next day, and crossing guards still had orders to shoot on sight any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were...
Yeah, what people always forget, you know, all the pictures and the videos about where Germans climbed the wall and crossing the border and everything, but it was actually a pretty spontaneous act from the Germans. And as you saw, like the border guards still had the order to shoot on people who tried to cross, but they were so overwhelmed and they knew that the order should go into place tomorrow, so they didn't know what to do, and eventually the guards were like, it's done. We see that the system is changing and everything is changing, and they just kind of, let's say, it capitulated to the masses.
Were allowed to pass through. East and West Berliners couldn't believe it and celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia, and a violent one in Romania brought to an end communist authority
Romania
in the
was
Eastern
pretty
Bloc.
violent.
America decided it would be best if it just stayed away and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate. Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic. So believe me, this is oversimplified, but it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the Greater Soviet Union. Communist hardliners were horrified at what Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, we have a time. So the hardliners had to concede and released Gorbachev. Wow. Thanks, Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation. In other words, you're no longer in charge. I am. Dude. So uncool. And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics. And the world got along together forever after. Right, guys? Ever
Who's
after.
there?
Right, guys?
Okay, so Trump, Putin, oh my God, his name. Okay, let's start just again. Okay, U.S., Russia, China, India, Israel, North Korea, Germany, France, Great Britain. that ending is cool.
Hey, this modern art thing is growing on me. Where can I learn to do that? Skillshare.
Nice ending. Okay, so yeah, they make really great videos. Once again, the original video. The link to the original video is in the description below. Check them out, give them a view and a like. I really appreciate those guys. They make really good videos and give the most important maybe information about the big things that happened out. So yeah, I hope that you enjoyed it. Once again, if you liked it, I would like you to be a part of the community. You can hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, so you don't miss out future videos. You can suggest videos in the comment section. I always appreciate your thoughts and opinions on the topics that we discuss. So don't be afraid to share it in the comment section. And yeah, until next time. See ya.